She was 26 years old and 8 months pregnant when the state decided she should die. She believed, in that moment, that this was what her life had been leading toward. What followed is something even hardened death row prisoners say they would never choose. For her own safety, the United States Department of Justice would later describe the place she was sent as one of the most abusive prisons in America, a place where corrections officers prey on the women they are sworn to protect. Where reporting abuse can mean isolation, retaliation, and weeks in solitary confinement. Where women are silenced, broken down, and erased from public memory. And Amelia Carr has been locked inside that system for nearly 16 years. Condemned to death for murdering her boyfriend's wife in the rural backwoods of Florida. But that is not the full story, because in 2017, something unexpected happened. Her death sentence was overturned. The state declined to pursue another penalty phase. Amelia Carr was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Many people would call that mercy, a second chance, a narrow escape from lethal injection. What Amelia Carr faces now inside Lowel Correctional Institution is not mercy. It is a different kind of execution, a slower one, a form of psychological torture that accumulates day after day. A lifetime inside the largest women's prison in the United States, where federal investigators documented severe and widespread sexual abuse, where the suffering does not end, and time itself becomes the weapon. Unlike execution, there is no final date, no release, no moment of closure, only endless survival. By the end of this video, you will understand why Amelia once said they call death row life row, because they are not dying, they are living. You will hear from experts. To understand how Amelia Carr arrived at the life she is living today, you have to start long before the crime, long before the courtroom, long before her name ever appeared in a headline. You have to begin with a child who never had the chance to develop a sense of safety, identity, or protection. Amelia Lily Carr was born into a world where the people meant to shield her became the source of her earliest and deepest wounds. From the time she could form memories, her home was not a refuge. It was a place of fear, confusion, and silence. Psychological evaluations would later describe Amelia as intelligent, perceptive, and emotionally complex. Her IQ was estimated to be well above average. On paper, she possessed the cognitive tools for a stable future. But intelligence does not shield a child from prolonged abuse. In many cases, it makes survival more complicated. Amelia learned early how to compartmentalize pain, how to detach from her body, how to survive moments that no child should ever endure. Beginning at the age of 4, she was repeatedly sexually abused by her father. The abuse did not happen once. It did not happen briefly. It continued for more than a decade, forming the emotional foundation of her development. When a child lives in an environment where violation is normalized, the concept of choice becomes distorted. Boundaries do not exist. Trust becomes dangerous. Love becomes inseparable from harm. For Amelia, childhood was not a period of growth. It was a prolonged state of psychological captivity. And when she finally spoke up at 15 years old, when she gathered enough courage to tell a teacher what had been happening to her, the system that was supposed to intervene failed her as well. Authorities opened an investigation. Evidence emerged suggesting the abuse extended beyond her father to include her grandfather. For a moment, there was a possibility of escape, possibility of accountability. But Amelia was still a child, surrounded by the same family structure that had enabled her abuse. Under pressure that was never fully documented but easily understood, she recanted her statement. The investigation ended. The adults went free. Amelia stayed. This is where many narratives simplify the story. They treat the withdrawal of testimony as a choice, as if a 15-year-old girl trapped in an abusive household operates with the same agency as an adult. Trauma specialists know otherwise. Retraction in abuse cases is common when the victim remains dependent on their abusers for shelter, food, and emotional survival. The danger does not disappear when a statement is withdrawn. It intensifies. By 16, Amelia was married. Shortly after, she was pregnant. Early marriage is often framed as rebellion or poor decision-making, but in trauma psychology, it is frequently a survival strategy. It represents escape, even if that escape leads into another unstable environment. Amelia would go on to have multiple children with different men, moving from one relationship to another, each marked by volatility, control, and violence. She filed restraining orders. She accumulated minor criminal charges tied to the men around her. The pattern was consistent. Her life did not spiral suddenly. It followed a trajectory shaped years earlier. In 2004, when Amelia was only 20 years old, her father was convicted of attempting to solicit the murder of his own family. Amelia was one of the intended targets. The man who had abused her for over a decade now wanted her dead. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. 4 years for a lifetime of damage. By that point, the psychological harm had already been done. The system again responded minimally to extreme violence. This is the context in which Amelia met Joshua Fulgham. By the time he entered her life, she was already deeply conditioned to chaos. Their relationship began under circumstances that mirrored many before it. Instability, emotional dependency, pregnancy, a promise of permanence that quickly dissolved. When Joshua proposed to Amelia while she was pregnant, it seemed on the surface like a turning point. A future, commitment. 1 month later, he married someone else. Heather Strong was not a stranger. She was the mother of Joshua's children and a constant presence in Amelia's emotional landscape. The dynamic between the three of them was volatile, overlapping, and fueled by jealousy, insecurity, and control. When Heather married Joshua, Amelia was 8 months pregnant and emotionally devastated. But instead of leaving the situation entirely, she stayed connected. She babysat the children. She remained in proximity to the source of her pain. This proximity is critical to understanding what followed. Trauma does not always produce flight. Sometimes it produces fixation. The need to resolve emotional injury by eliminating the perceived threat becomes overwhelming. By early 2009, the situation escalated rapidly. Joshua threatened Heather with a firearm. Charges were filed, then dropped. Behind the scenes, intimidation and coercion were already at work. When Amelia attempted to find someone willing to kill Heather for money, it was not the act of a calculating mastermind. It was the act of someone whose psychological framework had collapsed. When that plan failed, she moved forward herself. The crime that followed was brutal, premeditated, and irreversible. Heather Strong was lured, restrained, and suffocated. She died bound to a chair in a storage trailer. She was 26 years old. Nothing about Amelia's past excuses this act. Understanding context is not the same as erasing responsibility. But context matters when examining how a human being arrives at a moment capable of such violence. When Amelia was arrested, she gave multiple statements without legal counsel. Audio recordings captured conversations that would later be used against her. The legal process moved forward swiftly. In December 2010, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. During the penalty phase, her family testified about the abuse she endured as a child. Experts explained the long-term psychological effects of prolonged sexual trauma. The jury weighed this against the brutality of the crime. By a narrow margin, they voted in favor of death. Emilia Carr was sentenced to die by lethal injection. At 26 years old, Amelia Carr entered Florida's death row system. She became the youngest woman on death row in the United States. The sentence carried a finality that few people truly understand. Death row is not simply incarceration with an execution date attached. It is a psychological environment designed around waiting. Waiting for appeals. Waiting for rulings. Waiting for news that could mean life or death. Amelia was housed at the death row annex of Lowel Correctional Institution. Isolated from general population, she lived alone in a cell for 23 hours a day. Isolation is often portrayed as the harshest form of punishment, and in many cases it is. But for someone like Amelia, isolation also created a barrier, a distance from the chaos of general population, a strange form of protection. During her years on death row, Amelia developed routines. She read constantly. She studied history. She found religion. Alongside another condemned woman, she tried to reframe her existence. They referred to their corridor as life row. The language mattered. As long as she believed she was living, not dying, she could maintain psychological stability. Hope existed even if it was thin. Appeals were pending. Lawyers were involved. Media attention hovered at the edges of her case. Death row inmates exist in a paradox. They are condemned yet highly monitored. Every movement is documented. Every action is regulated. Advocacy groups track their cases. Errors in trials are scrutinized. The state must account for them. This scrutiny does not make death row humane, but it creates visibility. Amelia lived within that visibility for 6 years. In 2017, the legal landscape shifted. Florida's death penalty sentencing scheme changed following Supreme Court rulings. Amelia's appeals argued ineffective assistance of counsel and procedural errors. The state ultimately declined to pursue a new death penalty phase. In a decision that surprised many, her sentence was overturned. She was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On paper, this was mercy. A life spared, an execution avoided. Many people assumed the worst was over. But this transition marked the beginning of a different kind of punishment. Amelia was transferred out of death row and into the general population at Lowel Correctional Institution. The protections that came with condemnation disappeared overnight. Lowell is the largest women's prison in the United States. It houses thousands of women across multiple custody levels. Unlike death row, general population is defined by constant interaction, constant exposure. Hierarchies form quickly. Violence is unpredictable. Staff oversight varies. For inmates with histories of abuse, these environments are particularly dangerous. In December 2020, the Department of Justice released the results of a multi-year investigation into Lowell Correctional Institution. The findings confirmed what inmates had been saying for years. Sexual abuse by staff was severe and widespread. Hundreds of allegations were reviewed. Numerous officers were arrested, fired, or resigned under investigation. The report described an environment where reporting abuse often resulted in punishment for the victim rather than accountability for the perpetrator. Women who reported misconduct were placed in confinement. They lost jobs. They lost access to programs. Many recanted simply to escape isolation. The system discouraged accountability through retaliation. Abuse was not an exception. It was a pattern. This is the environment Amelia entered after being resentenced. No longer isolated. No longer high profile. No longer the subject of active appeals. She became one inmate among thousands in a facility the federal government had condemned. The visibility that once surrounded her vanished. Lawyers moved on. Media attention faded. Life without parole is not a pause. It is an erasure of future milestones. Psychologists who study long-term incarceration describe a critical difference between awaiting execution and serving life without parole. Execution, as horrific as it is, contains an endpoint. Life without parole does not. Time stretches endlessly. Days lose structure. Years blur together. Without hope of release, the mind begins to erode. For Amelia, this erosion was compounded by her past. Her childhood sexual abuse created a vulnerability that general population environments exploit. Continuous exposure to authority figures in a facility documented for staff abuse created constant re-traumatization. Survival required hypervigilance. Trust was impossible. Safety was temporary. She aged inside those walls. Her children grew up without her. Relationships outside slowly dissolved. Visits became less frequent. People moved on. The world continued without her participation. This is not a dramatic decline. It is a gradual one. A quiet extraction of identity. By 2025, Amelia Carr had spent 16 years incarcerated, 6 on death row, 9 in general population. She was no longer the youngest woman on death row. She was a 41-year-old woman serving a sentence with no end date. The punishment was no longer defined by fear of death, but by the certainty of time. To understand why Amelia Carr's life sentence is described by some as worse than death, you have to examine what remains when hope is removed. Time becomes the primary weapon. Not days or months, but decades. If Amelia lives into her 70s, she will spend nearly 30 more years inside Lowell. If she lives longer, it will be closer to 40. These are not years defined by progress. They are defined by repetition. On death row, each year meant something. Appeals, hearings, possibility, even disappointment carried meaning. In general population, time has no markers. There is no forward motion, only endurance. Criminologists describe this as psychological stagnation, a state where the mind exists solely to survive the present moment. Exposure is the second factor. General population at a facility like Lowell requires constant negotiation of danger. Violence between inmates, power imbalances, staff misconduct. Every interaction carries risk. Reporting abuse invites retaliation. Silence becomes survival. For someone with Amelia's history, this environment does not merely punish. It re-traumatizes. Former prison officials have acknowledged that women's prisons often receive less oversight than men's facilities or death row units. Resources are limited. Accountability is inconsistent. The result is an environment where harm can persist unchecked. For inmates serving life sentences, there is no relief on the horizon. The final factor is psychological erosion. Over time, identity dissolves. Without milestones, memory blurs. Birthdays lose significance. Holidays become reminders of absence. Loved ones age and die outside the walls. New inmates arrive younger. Older inmates disappear into infirmaries. Life becomes a series of losses without closure. Unlike death, there is no release, no conclusion, just continuation. Trauma researchers describe this as living grief, mourning a life that is still technically being lived. For Amelia, the person she was on death row, the woman who read history books and spoke about finding joy, no longer exists in the same way. Survival now demands emotional numbing. This does not absolve her of responsibility for Heather Strong's death. Heather was a mother, a daughter, a sister. Her life was taken violently and unjustly. Her children grew up without her. That loss is permanent. Justice must account for that reality. But Amelia Carr's case forces a broader question. What is the purpose of punishment? Is it retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, or suffering? When a death sentence is overturned and replaced with life without parole, the assumption is mercy. Yet in environments like Lowell, mercy can transform into prolonged destruction. Amelia will never be released. She will never rebuild a life outside prison. Her existence will end inside the same system that failed her as a child, punished her as an adult, and now sustains her in a state of permanent limbo. Whether that outcome is justice or something else entirely depends on how one defines accountability. Her story exposes the intersections between childhood trauma, adult violence, and institutional punishment. It challenges the idea that sparing a life automatically spares suffering. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether some sentences simply trade one form of death for another. In the end, Amelia Carr is alive. But life, stripped of hope, safety, and future, becomes something difficult to name. Not freedom, not redemption, just time. Endless, unchanging time. So why do many believe that Amelia Carr's life sentence may be worse than death? Because death has a conclusion. It is final. It brings an ending to suffering. When Amelia Carr was on death row, she lived with the knowledge that an ending existed. She fought against it. She feared it. But she understood that time was moving toward something. What she faces now is not an ending. It is repetition. An unbroken cycle of sameness. Waking up each morning inside a prison, the Department of Justice itself. Condemned. Navigating daily interactions with authority figures in a facility where abuse was documented as widespread. Avoiding conflict with other inmates. Learning when to stay silent. Learning when not to be seen. Eating food designed only to sustain. Working jobs that carry no purpose beyond passing hours. Returning to living spaces with no privacy. No control. No moment of real safety. Watching days turn into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years, years into decades, all inside the same concrete walls, the same metal doors, the same routines that slowly remove autonomy one piece at a time. Each passing year takes her further from the young woman who once stood in a courtroom facing execution, and closer to an older woman who will have spent her entire adult life inside one of America's most troubled prisons. When Amelia once referred to death row as life row, she believed she was expressing resistance, a refusal to accept execution, a determination to remain human. But in general population, that phrase carries a different meaning. Life row, not because life is being embraced, but because life is being endured. She is not dying by execution. She is fading slowly, day by day, year by year, in an environment where living itself becomes psychological punishment. This is her forever no parole, no release date, no final chapter. Only time stretching forward without mercy. Amelia Carr is now in her 40s. She has been incarcerated for nearly 2 decades, and she will die in prison decades from now. Outside these walls, the world continues. Heather Strong's children are growing up without their mother, raised by others, carrying a loss that can never be undone. So the question remains, was overturning the death sentence an act of mercy, or did it create a quieter, longer form of punishment, life without parole in a place like this, justice, or is it a different kind of death that simply takes longer? We want to know what you think. Share your perspective in the comments. If this story made you reflect, question, or reconsider what punishment truly means, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to Court of Secrets. In our next episode, we will examine other women whose death sentences were overturned and what life became afterward. Because behind every verdict there is a reality far more complex than the headline suggests.